In 1965, more than 30,000 rubber workers clocked in across a single American city before sunrise, Akron, Ohio. At peak capacity, its tire factories were producing tens of millions of tires annually, feeding a U.S. automobile market that had already surpassed 60 million registered vehicles. The industrial payroll generated inside this one city supported entire neighborhoods, schools, churches, and local economies. By then, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company had already held the title of the world's largest tire manufacturer for nearly half a century, a position it first secured in 1916 as the automobile transformed from novelty into necessity. Akron was not a supporting player in American industry, it was its rolling foundation. During the Second World War, that foundation became strategic infrastructure. After Japan seized Southeast Asian rubber plantations in 1942, cutting off roughly 90% of America's natural rubber supply, the federal government launched an emergency synthetic rubber program through the War Production Board. Goodyear became one of its critical industrial pillars. Akron's factories ran continuously, producing military truck tires, aircraft tires capable of absorbing brutal runway landings, fuel bladders, and synthetic rubber compounds essential for tanks and transport vehicles. Wartime production operated at relentless speed, and the city effectively became an arsenal of mobility. Rubber was no longer a consumer good. It was a national defense material, and Akron supplied it at scale. When the war ended, the machinery did not slow. It accelerated into peacetime dominance. The 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act triggered the largest highway construction program in American history, laying more than 40,000 miles of interstate roads across the country. Suburbs expanded, daily commutes lengthened, and vehicle ownership became a default expectation of middle-class life. Every mile driven guaranteed eventual tire replacement. Demand was not cyclical. It was embedded in the structure of American expansion. By the 1960s, Goodyear's global workforce would exceed 80,000 employees. Its manufacturing footprint stretched across continents. Akron alone employed tens of thousands in rubber production, in earning its title as the rubber capital of the world, not as marketing language, but as economic fact. Entire neighborhoods revolved around shift schedules. Factory whistles regulated daily life. A high school graduate could enter the plant floor and reasonably expect a career measured in decades, supported by union wages, healthcare coverage, and pension guarantees negotiated through powerful collective bargaining agreements. Industrial labor in Akron was not temporary employment. It was structural stability. The scale of that stability is difficult to exaggerate. In mid-century America, a single industrial sector inside one city supported a middle-class ecosystem at extraordinary density. Local diners opened before dawn to serve night shift workers. Mortgage approvals were routine for factory employees. Generational continuity was assumed. Fathers expected sons to follow them through the same gates. The smokestacks that defined Akron's skyline were symbols of permanence. And then permanence began to erode. In 1982, Goodyear closed its historic East Market Street plant, a facility that had operated for more than 70 years. The closure was not accompanied by collapse headlines or bankruptcy filings. It was framed as modernization and restructuring. Yet thousands of jobs disappeared from a single address. Conveyor systems were dismantled. Heavy presses were removed. The building that had once embodied industrial certainty was reduced to silence. But the contraction did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded across decades. Automation reduced labor requirements. Production shifted toward lower-cost regions abroad. Pension and healthcare obligations, once manageable within expanding payrolls, grew heavier as the active workforce shrank. In 2006 and 2007, facing rising raw material costs and intensifying global competition, Goodyear announced major restructuring plans across North America, and eliminating thousands of additional jobs and consolidating production capacity. The corporation endured. In the early 2000s, Goodyear generated more than $20 billion in annual revenue and remained one of the largest tire manufacturers in the world. Its brand persisted. Its blimp continued floating above stadiums. Its headquarters remained in Akron. But the manufacturing workforce that once defined the city had largely vanished. The same industrial corridors that processed tens of thousands of workers daily now stood redeveloped, repurposed, or empty. The economic density that once powered Akron's middle class thinned dramatically. Consider the final minutes of a shift in a plant that would never reopen. A time clock stamps its last card. A locker is cleared. Overhead lights dim across a production floor that once operated around the clock. Outside, a parking lot that once filled before sunrise sits partially vacant. There is no dramatic finale, only absence. In 1965, the synchronized arrival of 30,000 workers into Akron's factories was audible proof of industrial dominance. It was the sound of American manufacturing at full force. 4 decades later, that sound had faded without spectacle. How does the world's largest tire empire lose the city that built it? Chapter 1: The Rise. When rubber built an empire. In 1898, when the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company was founded in Akron, the American automobile industry barely existed. Fewer than 5,000 cars were registered nationwide. Most long-distance travel still relied on horses and railroads. Yet inside a modest brick factory along the industrial corridors of Akron, a group of investors committed $100,000 to a material they believed would shape the next century: vulcanized rubber. The company was named after Charles Goodyear, the 19th century experimenter who had discovered vulcanization decades earlier, a chemical process that stabilized rubber by heating it with sulfur, transforming it from a sticky, temperature-sensitive substance into a durable industrial material. Charles Goodyear himself had died in financial ruin in 1860, but his name carried scientific authority. It implied permanence and technological progress, two concepts America was rapidly industrializing around. Akron offered more than optimism. It had canal access, expanding rail connections, proximity to Midwestern industrial markets, and a growing pool of immigrant labor. Rubber manufacturing had already begun to cluster there in small operations. Geography did not guarantee dominance, but it created leverage. In its earliest years, Goodyear did not build automobile tires. It built bicycle tires. The bicycle boom of the 1890s swept across the United States with surprising intensity. Millions of Americans purchased pneumatic bicycles, and those bicycles required durable rubber tires capable of handling uneven roads. Inside Goodyear's early factory floors, raw latex barrels imported from overseas plantations were unloaded and processed into sheets of rubber compound. Steam rose from mixing mills, where heated rollers crushed and blended rubber with chemicals. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and oil. Workers manually fed material into primitive presses, shaping pneumatic casings at a pace that felt relentless for its time. The bicycle boom provided something more valuable than revenue. It taught the company how to scale. Rubber products wore out. They required replacement. Demand was recurring, not one time. Goodyear learned to refine compounding formulas, improve tread durability, and increase output speed without sacrificing quality. Production discipline formed early. Then came 1908. When Henry Ford introduced the Ford Model T, he did not simply release a new vehicle. He standardized mobility. The assembly line reduced manufacturing time and cost so dramatically that car ownership shifted from luxury to possibility. Within a decade, millions of automobiles were on American roads. Every vehicle required 4 tires, and typically a spare. Roads were rough, punctures common, tread life limited. Tire demand exploded in direct proportion to automobile growth. Goodyear expanded aggressively. New buildings rose across Akron's industrial districts. Production lines lengthened. Research laboratories developed improved tread compounds and structural reinforcement methods. Vertical integration strengthened control over materials and supply chains. The company invested in its own chemical research capabilities to reduce reliance on external innovation. Even by 1916, just 18 years after its founding, Goodyear had become the world's largest tire manufacturer. That title was not symbolic. Its output volume and production capacity surpassed competitors globally, driven by relentless expansion and America's surging automotive market. At a moment when car registrations were multiplying annually, Goodyear positioned itself as the primary supplier of an industry redefining transportation. Scale created confidence, and confidence accelerated expansion. When the First World War erupted, rubber manufacturing shifted from commercial supply to military necessity. Military trucks required reinforced tires capable of withstanding battlefield terrain. Early aircraft demanded specialized rubber components for landing systems. Goodyear secured federal contracts that expanded production schedules and hardened its relationship with national defense priorities. Wartime urgency forced rapid innovation in materials science and manufacturing efficiency. By the 1920s, Goodyear's factories dominated Akron's skyline. Massive curing presses operated in synchronized cycles. Conveyor systems transported partially assembled tires through staged heating processes. Output volumes reached levels unimaginable 2 decades earlier. The company invested heavily in branding to solidify its dominance, culminating in the launch of the Goodyear blimp in 1925. The blimp was more than advertising. It was psychological reinforcement. Floating above cities and sporting events, it transformed a manufacturing company into a national symbol of technological confidence. The Great Depression strained purchasing power but did not eliminate demand. Even when car sales slowed, existing vehicles required maintenance and tire replacement. Goodyear diversified into additional rubber-based products and navigated the downturn without abandoning its industrial footprint. Facilities remained large. Payrolls remained substantial. The culture of expansion persisted. Then came World War II, and rubber once again became strategic infrastructure. After Japanese forces seized Southeast Asian rubber plantations in 1942, cutting off the vast majority of America's natural rubber supply, the federal government launched an emergency synthetic rubber initiative. Goodyear became one of the central industrial participants in that program, producing synthetic rubber compounds and military-grade tires at extraordinary volume. Factories operated continuously, and output surged to meet wartime logistics demands. Akron functioned not merely as a commercial hub, but as a supply engine for a global conflict. By 1945, Goodyear had mastered scale on a level few industrial firms could match. It had embedded itself into the automotive economy, national defense infrastructure, and global distribution networks. Its production capacity spanned multiple massive plants designed primarily for bias-ply tire manufacturing, a design that had defined the early automobile era. But those plants were not flexible structures. They were capital-intensive industrial fortresses built for high-volume, standardized output. Entire factory floors were engineered around specific production flows. Retooling them required dismantling heavy machinery, reconfiguring curing systems, and investing millions in updated equipment. Expansion had been so rapid and so successful that fixed capital became deeply entrenched in a single technological paradigm. The workforce expanded alongside that capital. Organized labor strengthened during the 1930s and 1940s, embedding long-term wage structures, healthcare benefits, and pension commitments into the corporate framework. At the time, these agreements reinforced stability and loyalty. They also hardened cost structures that would later prove difficult to adjust. Dominance felt permanent because growth had been continuous for nearly half a century. Every external shock, from automobile mass production to global war mobilization, had ultimately strengthened the company. Expansion became reflexive. When demand rose, more plants were built. When contracts arrived, capacity increased. When markets widened, operations followed. By the end of World War II, Goodyear was not simply responding to industrial America, it was shaping it. Its factories defined Akron's skyline. Its payrolls defined the city's middle class. Its brand floated above stadiums and racetracks as a symbol of modernity. Yet embedded inside that dominance were structural commitments, massive bias ply plants, fixed labor contracts, capital locked into specific production technologies. The very infrastructure that delivered supremacy also limited agility. By 1945, Goodyear was not just a company, it was a system, and systems resist change. Chapter 2: The Golden Era. The rubber capital of the world. By the early 1950s, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company was no longer climbing toward dominance. It was operating at altitude. The war had ended. American industrial capacity was unmatched globally, and automobile ownership was accelerating at a pace few had predicted. By the end of the decade, more than 60 million vehicles were registered in the United States. Every one of them required 4 tires. Most required replacements within a few years. The arithmetic alone guaranteed relentless demand. At its mid-century peak, Goodyear's global workforce surpassed 80,000 employees, with tens of thousands concentrated in Akron and surrounding facilities. The company's annual output reached into the tens of millions of tires, and its share of the global tire market placed it firmly among the dominant manufacturers worldwide. In Akron alone, rubber employment across major firms exceeded 30,000 workers, creating one of the densest concentrations of industrial labor anywhere in the country. The payroll generated by this sector sustained an entire city. The scale was visible before sunrise. Parking lots surrounding the plants filled in waves as shifts rotated, lunch pails stacked in rows inside locker rooms. Steam rose from curing rooms while conveyor belts carried partially assembled tires through heat and pressure cycles that ran almost continuously. A line worker finishing the night shift might pass his neighbor arriving for the morning shift at the gate, both men wearing the same company patch stitched onto their jackets. On Fridays, pay envelopes translated directly into mortgage payments, grocery bills, and installment plans on new Chevrolets parked in modest driveways. Union contracts negotiated through the United Steelworkers had secured wages strong enough to build stability into working-class life. Healthcare coverage reduced catastrophic risk. Pension guarantees created an expectation of retirement security measured not in hope, but in calculation. In neighborhoods across Akron, small brick houses multiplied along streets like Firestone Park and Ellet. Home ownership surged among factory families. Lawns were trimmed on Saturdays, or church attendance swelled on Sundays. The industrial wage did not merely pay bills, it structured aspiration. The 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act intensified the expansion. As more than 40,000 miles of interstate highways stretched across the United States, suburban development accelerated and daily commuting distances increased. Tire wear rose with mileage. Replacement cycles shortened. Demand did not spike and fall. It compounded. For Goodyear, the system was self-reinforcing. More roads meant more driving. More driving meant more wear. More wear meant more production. Brand dominance extended beyond utility into spectacle. Goodyear's deep involvement in NASCAR racing positioned its products as performance-tested under extreme conditions. On racetracks where speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour, tires bearing the Goodyear name endured heat, friction, and stress before national television audiences. The message was implicit. If these tires could withstand racing extremes, they could certainly handle daily American roads. The Goodyear blimp, floating above sporting events and city skylines, reinforced the company's omnipresence. Few industrial manufacturers achieved that level of cultural visibility. Internationally, the company expanded its footprint with manufacturing facilities in Europe and Latin America to meet rising global demand. The post-war global order, shaped by American industrial leadership, created new automotive markets abroad. Goodyear's diversification appeared both strategic and inevitable. Production was strong at home and expanding overseas. Scale insulated risk. Inside Akron, prosperity felt permanent. Generational continuity defined the workforce. A father who had entered the plant in the 1930s watched his son get hired during the 1950s, expecting similar security. A mother budgeting household expenses did so with the assumption that her husband's position was stable. The factory whistle regulated daily rhythm. It was as reliable as sunrise. But beneath that visible prosperity, long-term obligations were accumulating. Union agreements grew more comprehensive as the workforce expanded. Pension commitments extended decades into the future. Healthcare costs, while manageable in a growing payroll environment, represented promises that would eventually outlast expansion cycles. Massive plants required constant throughput to justify their scale. Capital investments in bias-ply tire production dominated factory floors, with entire assembly lines engineered around that specific technology. At this stage, those commitments did not appear risky. They appeared responsible. They signaled maturity and confidence, yet they also hardened cost structures into permanence. Meanwhile, across the Pacific and in parts of Europe, a quieter shift was unfolding. Manufacturers were refining radial tire technology, which used steel belts arranged perpendicular to the direction of travel, delivering longer tread life and improved fuel efficiency. In the 1950s and early 1960s, radial tires were not yet dominant in the American market. Domestic demand was strong enough that incremental efficiency gains did not immediately disrupt established production systems. But subtle signs emerged. Dealership shelves that once displayed primarily American-made bias-ply tires began to include imported radial models. Shipping crates marked with foreign brand names appeared in distribution centers. Automotive trade publications discussed durability advantages measured in additional thousands of miles per tire. At first, the imports represented a niche segment, interesting but not threatening. Within Goodyear's plants, however, the machinery remained overwhelmingly configured for bias-ply production. Retooling for radial manufacturing required dismantling heavy curing presses, redesigning production flows, and committing significant capital to new equipment. When a company is operating at record output, replacing functioning infrastructure can seem irrational. The golden era masked this vulnerability. Profits remained strong. Demand remained high. Employment remained dense. The visible indicators of health, payroll size, factory output, brand dominance, reinforced confidence. The industrial soundscape of Akron during this period was relentless. Presses cycling, forklifts moving pallets of finished tires, whistles marking shift changes, race cars gripping asphalt on Sunday broadcasts. It was the sound of American manufacturing at its peak. Yet prosperity built on continuous expansion assumes that expansion will continue. Pension liabilities accumulate quietly. Healthcare obligations expand incrementally. Capital becomes embedded in specific technologies. Large plants resist rapid transformation, and innovation abroad does not announce itself with immediate disruption. It advances methodically. At its height, Goodyear embodied the industrial promise of the 20th century: scale, stability, and upward mobility anchored in manufacturing strength. Akron's skyline testified to that promise in brick and steel. But empires built on scale alone must eventually confront change. The empire was at its loudest and at its most fragile. Chapter 3: Cracks in the System. The Radial Revolution. The 1970s did not begin with collapse. They began with imbalance. For the first time in decades, the industrial architecture that had powered the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company no longer aligned perfectly with the direction of the market. The oil shock of 1973 triggered the first visible tremor. When OPEC production cuts sent gasoline prices soaring, American drivers began rethinking the kind of cars they owned. Large sedans gave way to smaller, fuel-efficient imports. Mileage mattered now in ways it had not before. efficiency shifted from marketing advantage to economic necessity. That shift exposed a structural vulnerability inside American tire manufacturing. Radial tire technology had been pioneered in Europe years earlier, most notably refined by Michelin in France. By the late 1960s, radial tires were already dominant in several European markets. Japanese manufacturers studied and improved upon that design in the early 1970s, pairing radial construction with lean production systems that emphasized efficiency, cost control, and minimal waste. By the mid-1970s, Japan had perfected mass radial production at competitive prices. The United States lagged. Goodyear had invested in radial research, but its massive production footprint remained heavily optimized for bias-ply tires. Entire factory floors in Akron were configured around that older architecture. Retooling required dismantling heavy curing presses, redesigning assembly lines, and committing enormous capital expenditures while still servicing existing demand. The timeline was clear. Europe pioneered. Japan perfected it. America hesitated. By the mid-1970s, imported radial tires were appearing more frequently in U.S. dealerships. Automotive magazines published comparative durability tests showing radials lasting thousands of miles longer than traditional bias-ply designs. Fuel-conscious consumers began shifting preferences. Market share did not evaporate overnight, but it began to erode. Meanwhile, labor costs in Akron remained among the highest in the global tire industry. Decades of collective bargaining agreements through the United Steelworkers had secured strong wages, comprehensive health care, and substantial pension benefits. Those agreements had built the industrial middle class. They had also embedded fixed costs into every tire produced domestically. Tension reached a breaking point in 1979. That year, approximately 20,000 Goodyear workers walked off the job in a strike that lasted several weeks, halting or severely disrupting production across multiple plants. The dispute centered on wages, benefits, and work rules at a time when the company was already under competitive pressure from foreign manufacturers. Production delays rippled through supply chains. The strike did not destroy the company, but it underscored how tightly margins had narrowed. A firm once buffered by dominance now felt vulnerable to interruption. Management faced a narrowing corridor. Rising labor costs and pension obligations weighed heavily on domestic operations. At the same time, foreign competitors produced radials more efficiently and at lower cost. Retooling entire plants required capital that was increasingly constrained. Automation began to alter the internal arithmetic. In earlier decades, a curing line might require dozens of workers across mixing, shaping, and finishing processes. As radial production expanded and new equipment was installed, certain press lines that once required large crews could operate with significantly fewer hands due to mechanized material handling and computerized controls. Efficiency improved, headcounts declined, output per worker rose. Then came 1986. That year, British financier Sir James Goldsmith launched a hostile takeover attempt targeting Goodyear. Corporate raiding had become a defining feature of 1980s financial capitalism. Investors accumulated large share positions in established industrial firms, then pressured management to restructure, sell assets, or increase shareholder payouts. Goldsmith built a significant stake in Goodyear and threatened to break the company apart if his demands were not met. To defend itself, Goodyear executed a massive leveraged share buyback, repurchasing billions of dollars of its own stock at a premium price. The takeover attempt failed, but the cost of defense was extraordinary. The buyback left Goodyear with billions of dollars in additional debt, dramatically increasing its interest burden and reducing capital flexibility. Cash flow that might have been directed toward modernization or domestic reinvestment was redirected toward servicing financial obligations. The company had survived the raid, but it emerged financially constrained. To stabilize its balance sheet, Goodyear sold non-core assets, streamlined operations, and intensified cost-cutting. Some diversification ventures were divested. Older facilities were evaluated not for symbolic value, but for return on investment. At the same time, globalization accelerated. Investment dollars increasingly flowed outward rather than inward. Modern radial production capacity expanded in regions with lower labor costs and fewer legacy pension burdens. While Akron's historic plants required costly upgrades to remain competitive, newer facilities abroad could be built from the ground up with optimized layouts and lower operating expenses. The shift was visible in capital allocation decisions. Rather than pouring millions into fully retooling aging Akron bias ply infrastructure, the company expanded production capacity in overseas plants better positioned for global distribution. The logic was not emotional, it was mathematical. Inside Akron, the impact was incremental but unmistakable. Production lines were consolidated. Older presses were idled. Automation replaced manual tasks. Employment thinned gradually, not explosively. Each adjustment seemed rational in isolation. Collectively, they signaled structural contraction. Foreign competitors deepened their presence in the U.S. market. Bridgestone strengthened distribution networks. Michelin expanded manufacturing capacity domestically and internationally. Japanese tire brands earned reputations for fuel efficiency and durability at competitive prices. Market share fragmented across an increasingly global field. Goodyear remained one of the world's largest tire manufacturers. It still generated billions in annual revenue. Its brand remained powerful, but dominance no longer guaranteed insulation from structural change. The combination of high fixed labor costs, rising pension liabilities, heavy debt from defensive financial maneuvers, and capital-intensive modernization requirements created a tightening cycle. Every major decision carried amplified risk. Financial discipline replaced expansion reflex. The radial revolution was not merely a technological shift, it represented a transformation in industrial philosophy. Lean production models emphasized flexibility and efficiency over sheer scale. Global supply chains replaced geographic concentration. Financial markets prioritized shareholder value alongside production metrics. By the late 1980s, Goodyear had navigated oil shocks, labor unrest, a foreign competition, and a hostile takeover attempt. It had restructured and refinanced. It had modernized selectively. On paper, it remained intact. But survival masked erosion. Akron's employment base had begun to contract. Capital investment increasingly flowed toward facilities outside the city. Automation reduced reliance on dense labor concentration. The system that had once depended on tens of thousands of workers in a single industrial corridor no longer required that density. The cracks were no longer theoretical. They were embedded in balance sheets, production lines, and workforce rosters. By the late 1980s, Goodyear had survived, but Akron had begun to bleed. Chapter 4. The Collapse. The Long Goodbye. The collapse of industrial Akron did not begin with bankruptcy or spectacle. It began with announcements written in neutral language. In 1982, the East Market Street plant in Akron, one of the historic pillars of Goodyear's domestic manufacturing base, was permanently closed. The official explanation emphasized modernization, efficiency, and alignment with market demand. The internal memo described the decision as necessary to maintain competitive positioning in a changing global environment. There was no language about families, no reference to generations, only cost structures and strategic focus. Behind that phrasing were thousands of paychecks. The East Market Street facility had operated for more than 70 years. It had survived world wars and economic depression. When its gates closed, it marked more than a corporate adjustment. It marked the beginning of an industrial drawdown that would unfold over 2 decades. The pattern that followed was not explosive. It was sequential. Throughout the 1980s, Portions of Akron's remaining tire manufacturing capacity were reduced, consolidated, or modernized with fewer workers. By the 1990s, additional operations were shuttered. By the early 2000s, the cumulative impact was unmistakable. From the tens of thousands employed in rubber manufacturing during the mid-20th century, Akron's tire workforce had fallen to only a fraction of that figure. Over roughly 2 decades, tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs connected to the rubber industry disappeared from the city and surrounding region. The timeline mattered. In the 1980s, layoffs were framed as temporary corrections. In the 1990s, they were described as restructuring for competitiveness. By the 2000s, they were normalized. Then came the 2006 to 2007 restructuring cycle. Facing rising raw material costs, high global competition, and mounting pension obligations, Goodyear announced a sweeping plan to close additional North American plants and eliminate thousands more jobs. Production capacity would be consolidated into fewer, more technologically advanced facilities. The language again emphasized efficiency and shareholder stability. For Akron, the meaning was cumulative contraction. Consider the final shift inside a plant scheduled for closure. The last tire rolls off the curing press, aimed still warm from heat and pressure. Workers who have spent decades mastering the rhythm of that machinery stand back as supervisors complete documentation. A foreman, who once coordinated multiple crews per shift, walks the production floor one final time. Lockers are emptied, hard hats are carried out, a time clock stamps its final card before being unplugged from the wall. The overhead lights dim. Outside, a security guard chains the gate. There is no applause, no formal goodbye. Only absence. And the emotional toll did not peak in one day. It accumulated. Multi-generational employment chains fractured. A father who had entered the plant in the 1970s expecting a 30-year career received notice of early retirement or layoff. His son, who might once have followed him through the same gates, found those gates closed. Healthcare and pension strain intensified the uncertainty. During the Golden Era, union-negotiated contracts had promised retirement security built on decades of stable employment. As the active workforce shrank and the retiree population grew, financial pressure mounted. Pension liabilities that were sustainable within expanding payrolls became heavier within contracting ones. For many retirees, the strain arrived in the form of official correspondence, a benefits notice outlining revised healthcare contributions, a pension statement adjusting projected payouts. The language was precise, actuarial, and impersonal. For the recipient, it translated into recalculated retirement plans and rising medical uncertainty. Inside corporate headquarters, these changes appeared as necessary recalibrations. Spreadsheets modeled long-term obligations. Analysts calculated cost savings. In one restructuring communication, management emphasized optimizing asset deployment and aligning production footprint with global demand realities. The words were accurate in financial terms. They did not acknowledge the shuttered storefronts near former factory entrances or the shrinking enrollment in neighborhood schools. The shift toward global production accelerated during this period. Plants in Asia and Latin America expanded capacity, benefiting from lower labor costs, newer infrastructure, and proximity to emerging automotive markets. Modern radial facilities built abroad required fewer workers per tire produced due to automation and integrated supply systems. Economics favored dispersion over concentration. Akron's model, high-density, unionized, labor-intensive manufacturing, had defined mid-century American industrial strength. In the globalized 21st century, it became comparatively expensive. By the early 2000s, what had once been a dense network of tire manufacturing operations in Akron had largely dissolved. Former production sites were demolished or repurposed. Industrial corridors once alive with shift traffic grew quieter. Restaurants that once thrived on factory crowds adjusted to thinner margins. Real estate values fluctuated as stable manufacturing income declined. The collapse was procedural. It unfolded through board approvals, quarterly reports, and phased shutdown schedules. Each closure could be justified individually. Collectively, they hollowed out a century-old industrial concentration. Importantly, Goodyear did not disappear. It did not declare bankruptcy. It did not dissolve into liquidation. It adapted. It modernized. It remained one of the largest tire manufacturers in the world, generating billions in annual revenue and expanding through strategic acquisitions. That duality defined the collapse. The corporation endured. The city absorbed the contraction. For workers, the adjustment was not purely economic, it was psychological. Industrial identity, once stable and inherited, became uncertain. Retraining programs offered opportunity, but not equivalence. Service sector wages rarely matched union-scale earnings. The pension letter replaced the long-term promise. By the time the final major Akron manufacturing line ceased operation, the process felt almost routine. There was no single headline marking the end of an era. Instead, there were multiple announcements spaced across years, each trimming capacity, each reducing headcount. The most unsettling aspect of the collapse was its rationality. No single decision appeared reckless. No executive stood accused of sabotage. Market pressures were real. The competition was global. Debt obligations were binding. Automation was efficient. But rational decisions can still produce irreversible outcomes. A city that once processed tens of thousands of workers daily found itself recalibrating around far smaller industrial anchors. The echo of machinery faded gradually. The parking lots did not empty overnight. They thinned. Industrial oxygen was not cut off in a single stroke. It was extracted slowly, quarter by quarter. By the end, there was no dramatic finale, only the quiet certainty that the scale which had once defined Akron would not return. The machines did not explode. Weren't they simply stopped? Chapter 5: A Headquarters Without a Factory. When the contraction settled into permanence, the Goodyear name did not disappear from Akron. Its corporate headquarters remained in the city, a modern glass and steel complex rising not far from where smoke once defined the skyline. From the upper floors, executives could look out over neighborhoods that had once emptied at dawn as workers streamed toward curing presses and mixing mills. The brand endured. The industrial density did not. On one stretch of land where a tire plant had operated for decades, the contrast is almost cinematic. Archival photographs show brick walls blackened by years of industrial output, rail spurs feeding raw materials into cavernous loading bays, and parking lots filled before sunrise. Today, portions of that same ground are cleared and repurposed, converted into mixed-use developments, office parks, or research facilities tied to polymer science and advanced materials. Where forklifts once moved pallets of finished tires, landscaped walkways and office entrances now stand. The transformation is not decay. It is redefinition. But the employment scale is fundamentally different. Another former site remained vacant for years after demolition, fenced off and quiet, wind moving across empty asphalt where thousands once clocked in. The silence there feels less like redevelopment and more like residue. For displaced workers, reinvention was rarely seamless. Consider a machine operator who had spent 25 years on a curing line and was in his early 50s when layoffs arrived in the mid-2000s. Retraining programs offered certifications in healthcare technology or logistics management. Classrooms replaced factory floors. Instead of monitoring press temperatures, he studied spreadsheets and software interfaces. The transition was technically possible. Financially, it was narrower. A starting wage in a new field often fell short of what union-scale industrial pay had provided. Pride shifted from mastery of physical production to adaptation in mid-career uncertainty. That adjustment was not unique to one individual. Across Akron, former tire workers enrolled in community colleges, attended state-funded retraining initiatives, and entered sectors that did not replicate the compensation or cultural cohesion of the factories they replaced. The industrial badge that once signaled stability became a credential from a past era. Meanwhile, Goodyear's operational structure evolved decisively toward global integration. Production capacity increasingly shifted to regions with lower labor costs and modern infrastructure designed specifically for radial tire manufacturing. Plants in Asia and Latin America were expanded or constructed with advanced automation systems, optimized supply chains, and proximity to growing automotive markets. The logic was direct. Build where costs are lower, logistics are efficient, and growth is strongest. Tires sold in North America might now be manufactured thousands of miles from Akron, transported through globally coordinated distribution networks, and managed through centralized data systems. Automation amplified the shift. Modern facilities required far fewer workers per tire produced than mid-century Akron plants. Computer-controlled curing presses, robotic material handling, and integrated quality control systems reduced labor intensity while increasing output consistency. Productivity per employee rose sharply. Employment density fell. In 2021, Goodyear acquired Cooper Tire and Rubber Company, expanding its brand portfolio and global footprint. Strategically, the acquisition strengthened market share, diversified product lines, and reinforced competitive positioning against global rivals. From a corporate perspective, it was evidence of resilience and forward momentum. From Akron's perspective, it reinforced a harder truth. The company that had once concentrated tens of thousands of manufacturing jobs within city limits was now expanding through consolidation and global reach rather than domestic employment growth. The acquisition made Goodyear larger on paper, stronger in market terms, and more diversified across regions. It did not reopen shuttered Akron production lines. It did not restore the workforce scale of the 1950s or 1960s. The divergence between brand survival and community contraction became increasingly clear. Goodyear's annual revenues remained in the billions. Its sponsorships continued. The blimp still floated above major sporting events, signaling continuity and prestige. Yet the industrial ecosystem that once anchored Akron's middle class had permanently thinned. Redevelopment efforts brought new forms of energy to the city. Healthcare systems expanded. Universities strengthened polymer research programs. Entrepreneurial spaces emerged in refurbished industrial buildings. These initiatives reflected resilience and adaptation. But they did not replicate the employment concentration once generated by tire manufacturing. A headquarters without factories is not abandonment. It is transformation. Decision-making authority, brand identity, and corporate presence remain rooted in Akron. Production power, however, is dispersed across continents. The model that once required tens of thousands of workers in one geographic cluster now relies on automated systems distributed globally. For younger residents of Akron, Goodyear represents opportunity in a different way. Corporate roles, research positions, administrative careers. The industrial whistle that once structured daily life has been replaced by office schedules and diversified employment sectors. Its stability is no longer defined by a single employer dominating the skyline. The aftermath is not ruined. It is recalibration, but recalibration has scale. Goodyear survived by adapting to global competition, financial pressure, and technological change. It became leaner, more distributed, more capital efficient. Akron survived by diversifying and redefining itself beyond a single industrial identity. Yet the alignment that once bound company and city, production and place, payroll and neighborhood, factory gate and front porch, was permanently altered. Goodyear survived. The industrial Akron it built did not. Chapter 6. Bigger meaning. The end of industrial permanence. In 1916, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company became the largest tire manufacturer in the world. That achievement was not symbolic. It reflected a production scale aligned perfectly with the explosive growth of the American automobile. When the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act sent more than 40,000 miles of interstate concrete across the continent, Goodyear's dominance deepened. More roads meant more miles driven, and more miles meant more tire replacement. Expansion reinforced itself. For much of the 20th century, industrial success in America followed that logic. Factories expanded physically. Payrolls expanded proportionally. Cities expanded alongside them. In Akron, tens of thousands of workers once moved through factory gates daily, building a middle class dense enough to sustain entire neighborhoods. Industrial capitalism tied capital, labor, and geography tightly together. Production happened where workers lived, and corporate prosperity translated visibly into local stability. But by 1986, the equation had begun to change, when a hostile takeover attempt forced Goodyear to execute a massive leveraged share buyback. Billions of dollars in debt reshaped corporate priorities. Financial survival requires discipline. Interest payments replaced expansion reflexes. The center of gravity shifted subtly from factory floor output to balance sheet resilience. The contrast is almost architectural. On one side, a mid-century curing room, heavy presses cycling under intense heat, dozens of workers coordinating material flow, physical output measured in stacked tires leaving the line. On the other side, a modern boardroom, spreadsheets projecting cost savings, debt ratios, global demand forecasts. Both environments are rational. Both are necessary within their historical context. But they represent different definitions of value. Industrial capitalism measured success in tonnage, throughput, and employment density. Financial capitalism measures it in return on capital, efficiency ratios, and shareholder performance. When Goodyear restructured in 2006 and 2007, eliminating thousands of North American jobs to stabilize competitiveness, it acted within the latter framework. The decision preserved the corporation. It did not preserve the employment scale of Akron's past. Automation intensified that divergence. A mid-century plant required thousands of workers to sustain production. A modern radial facility, equipped with robotics and computerized curing systems, can produce equal or greater output with a fraction of the labor. Output rises. Employment falls. Productivity improves. Geographic concentration weakens. The acquisition of Cooper Tire in 2021 underscored this transformation. Strategically, it expanded Goodyear's global footprint and strengthened its brand portfolio. It reflected resilience in a competitive market. Yet it did not signal a return to Akron's mid-century manufacturing density. Growth occurred through consolidation and global integration, not domestic labor expansion. Civic loyalty and shareholder value rarely align perfectly in such transitions. When a plant closure is justified by lower production costs abroad or improved margins through consolidation, the decision can be correct within corporate accounting logic. It can also sever the economic thread that once tied company and community tightly together. In the 1950s, expansion in Goodyear's balance sheet meant more jobs in Akron. By the early 21st century, expansion often meant optimization elsewhere. The illusion was not that companies would never change. It was that industrial permanence could anchor a city indefinitely. Akron's skyline once glowed with factory lights operating through the night. Parking lots filled before sunrise. The synchronized arrival of workers marked the rhythm of the city. Today, parts of those industrial corridors have been repurposed into research facilities, office complexes, or open land awaiting development. The headquarters remains, but the dense industrial ecosystem that once surrounded it has thinned. The story of Goodyear is not one of disappearance. Tires are still manufactured. The company remains one of the largest in its industry. It navigated oil shocks, technological disruption, and global competition, debt pressure, and restructuring without collapsing into bankruptcy. It adapted. What changed was the relationship between scale and place. In the 20th century, dominance required physical concentration. Massive plants anchored entire regions. Employment density created political power and social cohesion. By the 21st century, dominance requires flexibility, automation, and geographic dispersion. Production networks span continents. Supply chains are coordinated digitally. Capital moves more easily than communities. The lessons embedded in Akron's experience extend beyond one company. They reflect a broader transformation in how value is created and preserved in advanced economies. The same highways that once amplified domestic tire demand eventually facilitated the distribution of globally manufactured goods. The same financial tools that protected companies from hostile takeovers constrained reinvestment flexibility. The same technological innovation that increased durability, reduced replacement frequency, and labor intensity. Consider one final image, a stretch of pavement in Akron where thousands once walked into a tire plant before dawn. Today, the gate stands closed. The building behind it has been demolished or converted. Traffic passes on roads that still require tires manufactured somewhere in the world. The product endures. The concentration does not. The industrial system that once made permanence feel inevitable proved contingent on specific economic conditions, limited global competition, labor-intensive production methods, and domestic market dominance. When those conditions shifted, permanence dissolved into adaptability. Goodyear survived by transforming into a global, automated, financially disciplined enterprise. Akron survived by redefining itself beyond a single industry. The 20th century built cities around factories. The 21st century asks cities to survive them. In the 20th century, factories built cities. In the 21st century, cities survive the factories.